And then when folks are ready, I will admit everyone.
Okay. My intro to you is going to be about 5.5 minutes. I tried to keep it short as possible, but.
On my end, it says the meeting is being recorded. Continue. I just click, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Just click continue.
Okay.
All right. So I'm going to go ahead and mute and stop my video, or I guess I'll keep my video on until.
Yep. I was just going to keep my video on until I get done talking here, which is not long. Just let me know when I'm supposed to start.
Basically, as soon as in 1 second, I'm going to just let everyone in. And when you're ready, you start, Corey, okay?
Okay. Okay, so, all right. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. We are very happy to have you all, and we are also very happy to be able to be presenting this program to you today. I am Corey Tratner. I'm one of the professors in the Occupational Therapy Department here at Springfield College, and I am also the chairperson of the Holocaust Committee. The Holocaust Committee has been in existence on Springfield College campus probably, I've lost count, it's probably for like 15, 20 years. And our typical way we do things when it's not COVID is have a program in the fall that deals with more current day genocides. And our program in the spring usually deals with the Holocaust from World War II. So we are very happy to have our guest speaker today. And I'm going to let Justine Diamond, Professor Justine Diamond, who is one of our committee members, introduce her in a moment. But I want to thank Justine and David McMahon and Simone Altamuri and Agnes Luskin and Lisa Bomberg and a few other members of our committee for all of the hard work that they have done this year, especially with COVID has been even more challenging, and invite students and other faculty to join our committee because we love having much input. So without any more ado, I am turning this over to Justine so she can introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Corey. Thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm really thrilled to see everyone here. And I cannot fully express how excited I am to introduce Marianne Ingram to you on Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. But first, I want to also thank those who made this event possible, the Holocaust Committee, as Corey listed, but especially Professor Corey Tratner and David McMahon, who is Director of Spiritual Life. And then also the co-sponsoring departments for this event. My department, the Literature, Writing, and Journalism Department, the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, and the Visual and Performing Arts Department. And of course, I am deeply grateful that Marianne agreed to join us today to read and talk about her memoirs. But before we get to that, just a little bit of housekeeping. So one, I understand this will count for the wellness passport, and that link will be in or is already in the chat for those students who are using it. So Marianne plans to read from and talk about her memoirs, and I know she's eager to hear your questions. So after she reads, we will enable the chat function so you can put your questions in the chat, or you can request to be unmuted to ask your questions directly. And we hope you will ask questions, but we just ask that you hold them until after her reading and talk. Also, just in case there are folks new to Zoom and you want to toggle your view to speaker so that you're just seeing the speaker as you go up to the right-hand corner of your screen and you move your mouse over there and you'll see a little word view, and then you can click on to speaker view, and then the speaker will be the center of your screen. Okay, so I just want to share one screen with you as I introduce Marianne. So My admiration for Marianne began at a very young age, when my parents became close friends with Marianne and Daniel in Washington, D.C. I was always happy to visit their house on MacArthur Boulevard in Northwest, where adults would talk art, literature, politics, where we ate Marianne's cooking, some of the most delicious food I've ever had. Marianne always made me feel welcome, even when I was the only child in the room of adults, maybe because I was the only child in the room. But then as a child, I had no idea that that same house, which I would learn later reading her memoir, The Hands of Peace, had also entertained literati such as James Baldwin and Harry Belafonte, but of course, well before my time. As a child, I also did not know the details of Marianne's experience in the Holocaust. I knew that she and her mother had escaped and later hid on a farm until the war ended, and that her father, a German Gentile, did all he could to protect his Jewish family, friends, and strangers. That Marianne and her mother managed to survive the Allied bombing of Hamburg, what she mentions in her memoir as British military historian Keith Lowe saying is, we now know to be the worst single bombing raid of the European war and the greatest man-made firestorm the world has ever seen, end quote. That they survived is a miracle. And I did not know about that until she wrote the essay Operation Gomorrah, her story of experiencing and surviving that horror, which was selected by David Foster Wallace for inclusion in the Best American Essays 2007, and then reprinted in The Hands of War, her first book-length memoir. Marianne writes, quote, "I wanted the book to be a memorial to those who were killed and a tribute to unsung heroes like my father and his brothers who were not Jews but suffered beatings, imprisonment, torture, and for some death trying to help us and others. I also wanted readers to know what it was like to be a child inside an exploding firestorm, surrounded by the charred bodies of thousands of children killed by Allied bombers. And I fervently hope that sharing such experiences would encourage more people to challenge calls for war and acts of war, especially those that take the lives of children," end quote. Thankfully for us, Marianne took up her pen as a way to heal from the trauma of surviving Nazi Germany. And Kirkus Review writes of her memoir, The Hands of War, that it is a well-honed tale of momentous courage, and that is definitely true. Also, another critic, Johansa Delgado, who was an MFA candidate at American University, wrote about Marianne's essay, Operation Gomorrah, saying, quote, "Ingram's writing pierces the heart in its unflinching clarity, each sentence a shard of glass. The lucid, steady prose leaves the reader devastated at what exactly a child of war can suffer and at what exactly the human race is capable of," end quote. Growing up around the Ingrams, I did hear snippets of stories about their civil rights activism, but it wasn't until I read Marianne's second memoir, The Hands of Peace, that I learned some of the amazing details. And so I'll just share one, which is the story that it was Fannie Lou Hamer on a long bus ride home from the 1964 Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City who convinced Marianne to join the Freedom Summer Project later the next year. So standing on the shoulders of giants. And yet Marianne's memoirs of her time in the civil rights movement are infused with humility. She writes, quote, "In the civil rights movements, there were hundreds of known and unknown heroes. I was not one of those heroes. At times I shared space in the same leaky boat, but with skin tones that would have given me privileged access to a limited number of life preservers," end quote. Unfortunately, today, we need Marianne's words and stories of how hate married to power can cause such destruction. But we also know that by understanding the past, by listening to first-person perspectives, living history, we can work toward a more inclusive future. Marianne's generosity of spirit and love for humanity infuses her memoirs and really everything about her, and infuses her struggles against fascism and racism. And she serves, for me at least, as a model for standing up against injustice, no matter where, while also embracing all the joy and creativity that life can bring. In that spirit, I am deeply honored to introduce Marianne Ingram.
Thank you, Justine, and thank you. I'm deeply touched and moved. Thank you for inviting me. It is a privilege to talk with you on this special day when I share the pain faced by African Americans, Hispanic and Asian Americans, and all oppressed and persecuted people. The last 5 years of your lives in America were very similar to the first 5 years of my life in Nazi Germany. In both countries, a mad ruler flouted the rule of law, incited we, the people, to embrace autocracy and extreme nationalism, and repeatedly demonized vulnerable minority groups. In Germany, his hatred was directed mainly at Jews. In America, he targeted immigrant groups and people of color, and just about anyone who criticized or dared to oppose him. Both men attacked the press, voting rights, and even truth itself. I began seriously to fear what was happening in America in the summer before we gave almost unlimited power to the man who actually lost the 2016 presidential election by 3 million votes. Walking beside the Potomac River, I told Daniel, my beloved companion, that I could hear my parents talking in the 1930s as they walked beside the river that runs through Hamburg, Germany. They were saying, "This can't be happening. We are too smart for this. He won't last. He will be defeated and things will return to normal." I was a child then and didn't understand the politics, but I felt the fear and the tension, and I felt it again beside the Potomac in 2016. Today, as every sensible person now knows, my parents were spectacularly wrong about Germans rejecting Hitler, and America's so-called founding fathers were equally wrong when they created the Electoral College. Many of the Third Reich's racist law, the so-called Nuremberg Laws of 1935, were based on laws that successfully subjugated African Americans. The Nazis actually sent a group of lawyers to America to learn how a respected republic could get by with in-your-face oppression of a minority group. According to my mother, one new Nazi rule prohibited doctors from helping a newborn Jewish baby to breathe. She told me I desperately needed such help, and a doctor at the Jewish hospital in Hamburg risked his life to give me a life. That's probably one of the reasons I hit the streets with a Black Lives Matter sign whenever the police choke someone to death. At the end of your last 5 years, a global pandemic, global warming, and endless conflicts are killing millions. To me, it is clear that you face a future with greater challenges than any previous generation, including the one that President Roosevelt predicted to have, quote, "a rendezvous with destiny." And that's why it is imperative for you to look at the past with clear eyes and learn. By the time I was 5 years old, Germany had been allowed to kill thousands of Jews and annex other lands with impunity. Encouraged by such, quote, successes, Germany's mad leader had invaded several nations on one pretext or another and was rather openly engaging in genocide. On the day before my 6th birthday, my beloved grandmother, Rosa Singer, was ripped from my arms and deported with more than 1,000 other Hamburg Jews to a killing site in Minsk, Russia. 10 days earlier, my uncle Hans, her son, who had taught me to read, was taken from our arms and sent with my Aunt Emma, her entire family, and more than 1,000 other Jews to the same killing site. There, they were made to undress and kneel beside a large ditch and then were shot. Those who didn't fall into the ditch were kicked or pushed, dead or alive, in the ditch. My grandmother was staying in my mother's apartment when they came for her. I kicked the shin of the policeman who pulled me away from her, and he picked me up by my throat and began to squeeze, harder and harder. Finally, his commanding officer ordered him to put me down. I think this is probably an additional reason I'm so incensed by chokeholds. The next day's newspaper proudly announced that the Nazis had made good on their promise to, quote, rid the city of its Jews. The US was still at peace with Germany at the time these genocide crimes were committed, but it pretended not to notice. After successfully murdering more than 1 million Jews without paying any price, the Nazis decided to install gas chambers in several concentration camps, such as Auschwitz, which were easily identifiable as death camps because of the elaborate rail network that connected them and the tall crematorium chimneys that sent smoke and human ash high into the sky day and night. Because my father was not a Jew, and because he and my mother were married before the Nuremberg Laws, the Nazis didn't order her deportation to a concentration camp until the summer of 1943. By that time, my middle sister Helga, who was blonde and fair, had been placed with a non-Jewish couple, the Pimbers, who lived in the outskirts of Hamburg and were part of my father's anti-fascist underground group. Without telling me about the deportation order, my mother sent me with my baby sister Rena to stay with non-Jewish relatives, and then attempted to take her own life, desperately hoping this would save her children. But I turned around halfway there and returned to our apartment, where I found my mother unconscious with her head inside the gas oven. I pulled her out, turned off the gas, opened windows, and waited. After many desperate hours, she revived. The next day, my father's cousin Inge arrived, concerned because a Jew living in her building had committed suicide after receiving the same deportation order. She took my sister Rena home with her, and the next night the Allies launched what they called Operation Gomorrah. 10 days and nights of bombing Hamburg civilians, sometimes with more than 1,000 bombers. In just one 4-hour period, they killed almost 60,000 civilians, most of them women and children. This was, quote, the deadliest single bombing raid in Europe in World War II, and it created, quote, the greatest man-made firestorm the world had ever seen. My mother and I were bombed out at ground zero and were not allowed in a bomb shelter or even a church basement. We spent 10 days and nights in flaming and exploding streets, often picking our way around charred bodies. I'll read from Operation Gomorrah in the Hands of War. Draping blankets over our heads like huge shawls, we ran to the large metal door that led to the basement shelter. Mother took the nozzle of a fire extinguisher and banged on the door until it opened. A man's head in a large steel helmet poked out. It was our block warden, Herr Wiedermann. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. An ear-splitting explosion answered, and he slammed the door. Mother banged some more, and Herr Wiedemann's head reappeared. We wedged our way inside. "You have to let us stay," Mother shouted. "We've been bombed out. It's certain death outside." Several of the people lying or sitting on bunks in the shelter got up and came over to the door. One, a rumpled, whiskered walrus of a man, held a lantern near Mother's face. "It's the Jews," a woman shouted. "The Jews, the damned Jews." The voice was neither young nor old, and there was no quality of mercy in it. In fact, it seemed that the woman had progressed from surprise to indignation to outrage as she repeated herself. Explosions smothered whatever else she said, and I desperately hoped others would be more compassionate. The explosions, although horrific, were much less frightening inside the bunker. But the next voice to rise above the din was Frau Wiedemann's. She yelled at her husband, telling him he had to put us out because he was in charge, and it was his duty to enforce the rules against sheltering Jews. "You'll be held responsible," she yelled. "Think of us. Think of your family." "Think of us, Daddy." It was Monica, my former playmate. She was holding her favorite doll tightly and turning slightly away as if she feared I might try to snatch it from her. And she was wrinkling her nose. "Think of us." The man with the lantern spoke up, his voice and breath thick with schnapps. "Listen to your family. Put the Jews out." "They're going to be deported in 2 days, Herr Wiedemann said. "I've seen the order myself." "All the more reason to put them out," the walrus man said. Herr Wiedemann turned to tell us to leave, but Mother interrupted, pleading with him and with the others to allow me, at least, to stay. An idea that was very upsetting to me, but seemed to find some support within. To my relief, louder voices shouted down the soft-hearted. "The Bolshevik Jews are behind this," a hoarse voice growled. "They sold us out. They told the English where to bomb." I found the idea exciting, but Mother said it was ridiculous. "My husband is in the Luftwaffe," Mother shouted. "He's on his way here now. You 'You' 'will' 'have' to 'answer' to 'him' if you put us out." "You'll 'have' to 'answer' to 'him' if you put us out." "You'll 'have' to 'answer' to 'him' if you put us out." "You'll 'have' to 'answer' to 'him' if you put us out." "You'll 'have' to 'answer' to 'him' if you put us out." The response was angry insistence on our immediate expulsion. Frau Wiedemann gave her husband a shove and he pushed open the door. Instead of going out, Mother stepped deeper inside the shelter. "You will answer," she shouted, and the room became silent. She didn't say anything more, but stood for several seconds looking into their faces, her dark eyes glistening in the lantern light. She looked hurt and angry, but cleansed of fear, almost triumphant. Many of the faces in the gloom began to look fearfully at us, apparently sensing that they had damned themselves by refusing to share their private dungeon. When another explosion rocked the building, Mother bent down with a calm, protective look and adjusted my blanket so that it covered my head. Herr Wiedemann grabbed her arm to force her toward the door, but she wrenched free. Then she picked me up and walked into the street as the door slammed behind us. A false dawn lit the southeastern sky, rouging Mother's cheeks and painting the walls of the building on our side of the street a glowing, lurid red. Through the openings of blasted windows, we could see orange and yellow flames dancing beside pianos, making bonfires of bookcases, curling around bedposts. A torrent of hot winds coursed down Hasselbrookstrasse, bending trees almost double, stripping off branches and leaves and tugging at our blankets. Although anti-aircraft guns banged away and searchlights still poked the sky, the bombing seemed to have diminished. Along the street, a geyser of water rose more than 3 feet above the pavement. Everything was unreal. We went back through the arched entrance to our courtyard and saw pink tulips of flame sprouting along the roof line not far from our apartment. And I've just dropped your note. When Operation Gomorrah ended, the Nazis naturally assumed we were among the many dead women and children so badly burned that they couldn't be identified. This enabled my father to arrange for us to hide with the Pimbers, who didn't much like Jews, but loved Helga and my father. Sometimes my mother and I hid in an earthen dugout, literally underground, and other times in a garden shack. And I'm going to read some more. We were both exhausted, limping, blistered, and bleeding from our ears and noses when we stumbled into a crater that had some water at the bottom. The crater appeared to be in a small front garden of what until recently had been a handsome brick home with bays and turrets, but was now a smoldering shambles. Mother thoroughly dampened her blanket and draped it over us. The terrible explosions seemed to have abated, although hundreds of incendiary bombs had fallen close by, some landing in rubble no more than a dozen yards away. A canister of liquid phosphorus had hit an office building just down the avenue. As the phosphorus burned and dripped its way through floor after floor, it looked like the lights were being turned on by someone descending methodically through the building. Before the phosphorus reached the ground, flames were leaping from the windows of the upper floors. Next, I saw a woman carrying an infant come running down the street along the same route we had taken. She was followed by a young man dressed in khaki shorts and in the khaki shorts and shirt of the Hitler Youth. I thought they must be fleeing from a bomb shelter that had been damaged, possibly the one Mother had been heading for when we first left our apartment building. The woman looked to be about Mother's age. Her dress appeared to have been burned, leaving her almost completely naked below the waist. Despite his agile build and hiking shoes, the boy seemed to be having trouble keeping on his feet. I thought his trouble might be due to the hot wind roaring down the avenue in front of us, and almost expected to see him lifted up as he ran. Instead, after passing at a gallop, he slowed to a grotesque caricature of walking, more like slow motion skating, one leaden foot moving seconds after the other, with his arms spread out from his sides for balance. It took a while before I realized that both he and the woman were wading in molten asphalt. The woman slipped a couple of times and touched the pavement with one hand, but managed to recover. Then she slowly fell headfirst toward the street, twisting at the last moment so that she landed on her back with a baby on her chest. The boy tried to reach her, but slipped and fell, got up and fell again, and then again. Despite the incredible noise, I thought I could hear their screams, and ducked down in the crater with my eyes closed and my hands over my ears. There was another incident that has stayed with me for all this time, and that was a fireman on a ladder falling into a pool of flames. It was a gruesome, horrible thing. When Operation Gomorrah ended, the Nazis naturally assumed we were.
You've read that part.
Yes, I'm sorry. While we were hiding, my father was imprisoned by the Gestapo for helping Belgian Jews avoid being deported to death camps. Eventually released to fight on the Russian front, he refused to fire his weapon at the Russians. I didn't learn about that refusal or the real reason for his imprisonment until long after his death. I thought he had been caught doing other underground activity described in my book. But I knew his steadfast and often dangerously unlawful support was the reason my mother and I and my two sisters survived, while some 40 Jewish relatives and in-laws perished. Many of them are in a wedding photo in the hands of war. My father and his 6 brothers fiercely resisted the Nazis, and 2 of them paid with their lives in France, and the others in the war. Only one other than my father survived. Before the war, my father was tied to a lamppost and beaten almost to death in a futile attempt to force him to abandon us. The damage they did to his kidneys was a major cause of his death in 1973. Until then, he exposed and opposed fascism without let-up and set an example of compassionate activism that I cherish and tried to follow. There is a sidebar. Aryan husbands of Jewish women most often left their wives. Contrarily, Aryan women with Jewish husbands tended to stick to their husbands. After the war, most Germans were hostile to Jews and only regretted the hardships of defeat. I and my younger sisters attended a Zionist school for Jewish children, and with incredible survival stories, but except for us, without parents or home or country, some of them did not know their names or when they were born or where. So they were sent to Palestine, usually illegally. Some of their stories are in the hands of war, and some are still friends. Although many fought in one or more of Israel's wars, they pursue peace with Palestinians because, to quote them, "We know what it is like to be stateless refugees." And I'm going to read another part. Oops. I think I'm losing something. Sorry. Okay, here we go. I'm going to read a story about Uri, who was also sent to this Zionist school with several hundred children who survived Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Uri and his family were sent to Auschwitz. His parents were murdered there. Uri and his sister were sent to Essen to work for Alfred Krupp, the Cannon King, along with 500 young Jewish women. During that last terrible winter of the war, after their wooden clogs had broken apart and their feet were bloody and oozing pus, the battered, starved, severely frostbitten women were marched barefoot for 9 miles twice a day through the main streets of Essen, letting everyone see how the Cannon King and his country dealt with Jewish women. To heighten their humiliation, the guards shaved grotesque patterns on the women's heads, the most derisive design being a Christian cross to mark the Jews' heathen status. Alone among Krupp's 100,000 slaves, the Jewish women were not allowed to use toilets in the plants or foundries where they worked, but were forced to go out in the open. From time to time, the screams of one or more women being punished or tortured near Krupp headquarters reached the ears of the firm's top executives and directors. The response, if any, was simply to have a secretary close the windows. When the Jewish women returned to their barracks at day's end, they were confronted by SS guards recruited by Krupp, who beat them with metal truncheons at the slightest provocation or simply for sport. As the Allied armies drew closer, brutality grew more frequent, and the guards taunted the women, saying that there would always be time to kill them before they could be liberated. But the most terrifying event of every evening was the arrival in the women's quarters of the short-legged SS camp commander. As every Krupp official and most of Essen knew, his specialty was putting out eyes with his whip. He also delighted in lashing other parts of the body and sometimes flayed women to death. Toward the end of the war, Krupp's special train transported surviving women to death camps. Some survived because the ovens and gas chambers were overcrowded, or his sister was murdered. Krupp served only 2 years in cushy confinement before America pardoned him and gave him millions, making him one of the richest men in the world. To this day, I boycott all Krupp and related products. In 1952, I think I forgot to read one part of the hiding. In 1952, I came to America on a student visa to study psychology and develop as an artist. On my own in New York, no one seemed to care whether I was a Jew or whatever, and I felt free for the first time. But I soon realized that African Americans and Puerto Ricans were ghettoized and treated much the same way Jews were in Europe before the Holocaust. My first protest was to resign an internship at an advertising agency when I learned that a better educated Black woman could only work there as a cleaner of the ladies' room. She and I became friends. When I met Daniel, I was working at the Museum of Modern Art, surrounded by great art and aspiring artists. He was a writer, editor for a major publisher. We were both happier than we had ever been, but I was experiencing PTSD, often triggered by the sounds of alarm and merely talk of war on the evening news. Disturbing dreams frequently interrupted my nights, and I began to write about my experiences as a form of therapy. In 1957, Daniel gave me a dictionary as a birthday present to help me write in English. And I wrote every day at a table reserved by the owner of Café Reggio, Hilda, on McDougal Street in Greenwich Village. And today, I still write every day and still have that dictionary. But when I tried to write about Operation Gomorrah, I couldn't, no matter how hard I tried, until one night, lying and sometimes crying in Daniel's arms, I experienced total recall, down to the color of the panties I was wearing when the bomb struck our building. And the next day, I wrote down what I had remembered, and it helped a bit as therapy. But when Daniel got a much better job in Washington, D.C., and we moved there in 1960, we saw that overt racism infected almost every aspect of life in the nation's capital, where residents weren't allowed to vote. We joined the Congress of Racial Equality and began to protest racism in housing, employment, healthcare, education, recreation, justice, welfare, etc. The Hands of Peace describes 2 police brutality cases that illustrate the tangled web of structural changes needed for real reform. In 1963, I was a volunteer worker for the March on Washington. The Washington Post, which had no Black reporters or editors, was a big problem because it repeatedly highlighted the possibility of violence. As the world knows, that march was a giant Gandhian step forward and led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That year, I coordinated Washington's participation in a 4-day-a-night vigil on the boardwalk at Atlantic City to support the seating of the Mississippi Freedom Party delegates at the Democratic National Convention. We didn't win that fight, but we ended racial exclusions in such conventions for all time, I hope. At the urging of civil rights heroine Fannie Lou Hamer, I went to Mississippi a week later to work as a staff member of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. My jobs were to run a freedom school and help Black citizens to register to vote. The murders of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman were still at large when the Ku Klux Klan burned a cross in front of my school. I painted freedom on the charred cross, and they came to get me. I'll tell what happened by reading from the hands of peace, the hands of war.
The peace ship has a cross.
And here's the cross. I lived in Morse Point, which wasn't far from Pascagoula, with my beloved Mrs. Scott and her husband. He had a shotgun placed on a chair beside his bed because the whites circled the modest Scott house every single night. Morse Point was the SNCC office, and Tilman McKellar was the project director. My school was in Pascagoula. I continue to derive tremendous satisfaction from the school and my relationships until the afternoon when I received a phone call telling me to shut down the school. The call was not totally unexpected. It must have been infuriating, even humiliating for Klansmen to see their cause become an icon of resistance. Earlier in the day, I had begun to think it might be their day for revenge when I realized that the same car had been making slow circuits around our block throughout the morning. I couldn't see the driver clearly, but it looked like a woman. And I told myself there was no reason to connect her behavior to the school. I was more concerned by a pickup truck driven by a man that passed in front with less regularity. So I was pleased at first that a woman responded when I stopped teaching to answer the phone. Having received crank calls before, I was about to say, "You have the wrong number," and hang up. But I was stopped by the chillingly cultivated tone and language of the caller. She said that I had ignored their warnings and flouted their traditions for much too long, and they were not going to allow a subversive alien to poison the minds of Negro children any longer. She said men were coming to shut me up and shut the school down permanently. I didn't think the woman was bluffing, but even if I had, I wouldn't have risked keeping the children with me. I told them that I had to close the school and that I wanted them to go home and do homework or memorize a poem or draw me a picture and bring it with them tomorrow. If anybody needed a book, I said, they could take one of the thousands of copies of Amy Vanderbilt's complete book of etiquette that I have received from its publisher, the only publisher to respond to my appeal for teaching materials. I had so many copies that I was able to make room dividers of them by stacking them on the floor. But as soon as the last child had gone, I began to regret that I hadn't gone home with one of them, or at least send a message to a parent to let someone know what was happening, what was going on. Because SNCC's phone bills had become larger than the organization could afford, it had installed payphones in all its offices. And I discovered after I was alone that I had used up all my change earlier in the day. I couldn't even reach an operator or call the police without a coin. I searched every conceivable place where I might have put one, but found nothing. Not wanting to abandon the school and not having any transportation anyway, I had little choice but to wait and hope that Tillman would come early to pick me up, or someone with change would drop by for a visit. I tried to write a letter to take my mind off the emergency, but nothing worked. After a time, the phone rang again. It was the same woman. "I warned you," she said. Then the phone went dead, and I became very frightened. I wanted to hide, but there was nowhere to go. I started frantically repositioning the Amy Vanderbilt books, trying to create a protected corner. But after I had walled myself in, I decided that I did not want to be found cowering behind those books. I tumbled the books onto the floor, grabbed a worn out broom from the kitchen area, and moved toward the entrance. To hell with nonviolence. If anyone came through that door, I was going to swing. I stood there for I don't know how long until I heard the clump of footsteps on the front porch. I retreated a few steps toward the center of the room and stopped. When Stokely Carmichael rushed in the room, followed by Larry Giard and Tillman, I went limp all over. In fact, I slowly swooned and would have fallen to the floor if Stokely hadn't caught me. When I could, I explained what had happened. Stokely said that one of my students, a little girl, had told her mother that I had sent everybody home after receiving several phone calls that seemed to upset me a lot. The mother had called Kofor's office in Jackson, which had called Moss Point, where Stokely and Larry were meeting with Tillman, and they had then hurried to Pascagoula. On the way home to Moss Point, I noticed that Stokely was not wearing an earring. I wanted to ask if he sometimes wore one, but I didn't. The school was not burned down that night, and I returned to teach armed with dimes. In time, it was torched, however, and about all that remained were ashy mounds of Amy Vanderbilt's complete book of etiquette and a twice-charred cross. Despite the murders and KKK terror, we were able to demonstrate through the Democratic Freedom Party that African Americans would vote in large numbers if given the chance. After the election, I was arrested, however, and had to leave the state or go to prison. Months later, we were forced to leave our rented house in Chevy Chase, Maryland, because the neighbors were incensed that we were helping a Black family find a home in the area. When they threatened to kill our 3-year-old child, we moved back into DC on the spot. In 1965, the brutality inflicted on African Americans protesting the denial of voting rights in Selma, Alabama, re-energized the rights movement and inspired President Johnson to get Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act. This move proved to be a high watermark for the civil rights movement, and as we saw recently in Georgia, has continued to inspire African Americans to vote, even though the Supreme Court stopped enforcing the act. In the meantime, however, the civil rights movement had opened the gates for the anti-war movement, the women's movement, and the phenomenal gay rights movement. And in 1984, in one of the most wildly successful protests ever, 6 of us began picketing the South African embassy. After a time, we had many more protesters because civil rights leader Marianne was DC's mayor, and word spread to politicians and celebrities that they could get harmlessly arrested in a noble cause. Congress overrode President Reagan's vetoes and imposed sanctions on South Africa. Other countries did the same, and suddenly Nelson Mandela was free at last, and South Africa abandoned apartheid. There's a lot more civil rights history to learn from, including Germany's decision to examine its history and embrace empathy, which has transformed it from worst offender to best example. And while people of the same nationality, faith, and color have continued to slaughter one another, we now have scientific proof that race is a myth, that as Hawkins and Tyson's have taught us, we are all made of stardust and belong to the same human family which began in Africa. But it is also true that the future we face now is more threatening than the one I faced as a child. Solar and nuclear annihilation were not in the picture then, and the emerging so-called Cold War was offset somewhat by the realization that international cooperation was needed to keep the wicked from blowing up the world. The trouble is, savage religious combat, high-tech economic warfare, and a surge in authoritarian nationalism have just about overwhelmed internationalism. The loss of millions of lives because of the chaotic response to COVID-19 illustrates how far we have regressed. Already, catastrophic climate change is close to the point of no return, and thousands of nuclear weapons are in, to put it mildly, very unstable hands. And to add to these problems, we have just experienced a violent and broadly supported attempt to overturn a presidential election, followed by hundreds of new legislative attempts to suppress voting by people of color. Because of my experience of Nazi fascism as a child, I tried to warn as many people as I could of what was coming. I spoke to individuals and groups, and sometimes to the consternation of the officials who invited me. I even lectured the top brass at the NSA. And during the first 4 months after the election, we went every day to the White House with signs saying, "Resist fascism, reject Trumpism. The American press, which now speaks often about the growing fascism, pointedly ignored us. The foreign press frequently interviewed us, including the Russian press, which had the only TV crew at the Israeli embassy when we protested snipers shooting Gazan kids flying kites with homemade Molotov cocktails somehow attached to their tails. The most important lesson I learned from the Holocaust was to oppose oppression wherever I could and however I could. I learned that from experience and from my father's example. Putting that lesson into practice non-violently in the American Civil Rights Movement and in similar causes transformed me from a survivor of inhumanity to a fighter for humanity. Believe me, it is better to stand with the oppressed than be an oppressor. And as you are aware, conditions here and elsewhere became progressively undemocratic all the way up to the violent attempt on January 6 to overturn the national election and murder key officials who stood in the way. This attempted coup, organized and orchestrated by the POTUS, was probably too preposterous to succeed, even though the majority of Republican congressmen voted for the same outcome. But next time, after a life of activism, I still do what I can, but you and your young cohorts around the world are the ones who are going to have to deal with the complex existential threats that confront civilization. So you can ask questions, or much better, tell me how you plan to overcome non-violently. I invite your questions, and I thank you for listening.
Thank you, Marianne. Yes, and if you want to use the reactions button to show your appreciation, please feel free. And so now just a reminder that we'll disable the chat. And if you want to ask a question, feel free to put your question in the chat or just indicate that you have a question, and then we will invite you or David will unmute you. So yeah, David, is it disabled now?
People can now begin to use the chat and can also unmute themselves.
Great. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so please ask your questions. Marianne, I was going to ask you, maybe as a starter, and you did talk a little bit about your experience under the Trump presidency, but you opened with the comparison between 1930s Germany and then 2016. And I was just wondering if you wanted to say any more about your experience of, well, I know during Reagan's, when Reagan was reelected, you and Daniel left the country, right? And
Right.
And that for me, I was young then. It was such a, it was such a incredible kind of something I'd never imagined could happen, right? That someone could have that conviction and leave, right, in protest. And I imagine you felt the same way when Trump was elected. But yeah, what else? How did you experience?
I did.
Reagan had invented the show.
The reason I felt so strongly against Reagan was that he opened his campaign in the Neshoba County, Mississippi, where the 3 civil rights workers were murdered. And to me, that was such an horrible, in-your-face offense that
He identified with the killer.
to identify with the killers was to me so outrageous. And in discussion with what I considered a good friend who defended this, I was so appalled and so devastated, and I thought I couldn't possibly live in the country anymore, because I just didn't see how I could maintain any semblance of sanity. And so we sold our house and everything in it. And in fact, I had one very modest little possession for which I had paid 17 cents when Daniel and I first lived together. And as I was selling everything, I put everything out for bids. I didn't put prices on it. I just say, tell me what you want to pay, except on this little modest little thing. And I put 17 cents on that. And your mother bought it. So anyway, so we left and lived in Tuscany for many years. And then we moved to a Sicilian island off the western coast of Sicily. We participated in a lot of demonstrations when Bush commenced a war against Iran. And in fact, we were driving through Ireland one afternoon. Iraq, yeah, sorry. We were driving through, wild Ireland, and there was a little old man listening to a tiny portable radio to the fact that America had gone to war. And after greeting us, and after we had expressed a desire for some tea, and he noticed that we definitely weren't Irish, he said, well, can you imagine that they would go to war if Iraq were growing potatoes? And so, of course not. And we also protested in Firenze a lot and everywhere, Palermo. And it was joyous. And but we could see the warplanes going over the island. It was very scary. In 2016, our oldest grandson, Sam, who was then 14, not quite 14, asked me whether we were going to leave the country if the man was going to be elected. And Daniel and I had been talking about that quite a bit, throughout that summer, because I had such bad PTSD because I thought that history was repeating itself and no one was stopping it. And I told Sam that we were thinking about that. And then Sam, in a very plaintive tone, said, then please take us with you. And then I realized that it would be really cowardly for us to leave when everyone we knew and loved was left behind, having to cope with the horror, the impending possible horror. Just before the election, I decided to do something really odd. I set myself a task of asking 100 people, very unscientific, who had sported hate hats and other insignia, to tell me three positive reasons why they would vote for that man. Not a single person in 100 people came up with anything positive, but they came up with such hateful rhetoric against Hillary Clinton. It was bone-chilling. It was absolutely terrifying. And I realized that we had descended into a horror history. I stopped after the 100 because it was my unscientific. We demonstrated after the election constantly, or at first 4 months, every single day. It was also extremely cold in the beginning. And we were confronted often by his supporters who were the most hateful people. You know, if you can imagine that a stranger accosts you with, you know, hateful threats and stuff like that, except it's no longer unimaginable. We see it, you know, Asian Americans are being, you know, old women are being kicked to the sidewalk and beaten, and we see this violence toward other human beings. It is so brown shirt Nazi Germany that it is impossible. My PTSD and terror has increased. I'm greatly relieved that he did not win, because the world would be ending if he had been reelected. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And so we battle, you know, we demonstrate. COVID had sort of curtailed a lot. Our last demonstration was in front of St. John's Church, where the quotes leader of the free world held up a Bible and sicked horses on us. And it also became increasingly more dangerous because of COVID and because of people behaving in such violent ways, things I hadn't seen since I was a child. In 2008, the day after Obama was elected, at our metro station, just a couple of blocks from our home, people were out there with big posters of Obama as ape, as Hitler, with Hitler mustaches, and hideous rhetoric. Daniel tried to talk to them when an elderly gentleman came up and told him, you know, it's pointless, you know, there's no point in talking to them. The day after Biden was elected, at the same metro stop where after the coup attempt, after the storming of the Capitol, and the city was just occupied with, you know, soldiers and guns and war machinery, at the same metro stop were people doing the same thing, this time with Biden's image. And I asked one of the young soldiers whether there wasn't anything that, you know, he could say to them to make them stop it. And he said, oh, I hadn't even noticed. So it is what it is, as he said, but it's also incomprehensible to me how America could have elected this person when we knew so much about him that was, you know, reason not to elect him. how women, white women, could have elected a man who boasted on molesting women. I tried to get it into my head, but I failed to really put it all together, except I think we are living in such dangerous times. And I am hoping that Biden administration will be successful in getting us out of it. But I don't believe that it will be possible until all of these people somehow, I don't know, disappear.
At least be held accountable, right?
Yes, yes.
So we do have some questions in the chat. I'm excited.
Okay, okay.
So I'm going to read the first one from DTI3. What was it like returning to Hamburg, particularly German attitudes, and your returning to the scenes of your childhood?
A very strange experience because it was scary. Because every time I saw somebody old, I kept thinking, oh my God, are they the ones who ratted out the Jews?
That was early.
And we made friends with a group of young and older gay men. For some reason, they were the most liberated people we met. Many Germans had the attitude that it's in the past and we should forget about it. Even some people I came to be close to had that kind of attitude. I don't want to talk about it. You know, it's no longer necessary. But Der Spiegel started having documentaries on television, which were so profoundly insightful. They said, for example, that the Gestapo managed only to corral 10% of German Jews to be murdered, that the other 90% were ratted on by neighbors and friends. And neighbors would go and loot the apartments of the Jews who were their neighbors, had been forced to leave because they were sent to concentration camp. They also said that it is impossible for any German who was not a child to say that they didn't know what was going on, because the Jews were paraded through the street to the place from where they were deported, which was between the central train station and the University of Hamburg. And this was a daily event. They saw this. So Der Spiegel also said that it is a lie to say they didn't know. Every German knew. I had wanted to go to school since I was about 2 years old. It was my fervent desire to go to school, but Jews were not allowed to go to school. By the time I became school age, it was no longer possible for Jews to go to school. When I finally did go to school in late 45, I was the only Jewish child in the school. My teachers were all Nazis, unreformed Nazis. The classmates were the children of Nazis. So every day was being spat on, being called names, rocks thrown at me as I left or on my way to and from school. It was nightmarish, and all I wanted was not to go to school. My father insisted that I learn to stand up against such things. Oh, it was very difficult. I was only 10 years old. But in Germany, we met very many people who confronted their elders, their parents and grandparents. What did you do? Were you one of the people who denounced a Jewish neighbor? And so it was this ambivalence of being in the place that had persecuted us, that had killed all but 3 members of my family, my Jewish family, and some of my non-Jewish family. During the entire time we lived there, I never went out by myself. It was some kind of self-protection that I believe I didn't need. I really believe that I, in my sane head, believed it was unnecessary for me to fear. In my scared head, I couldn't even go to the bakery to buy bread without Daniel going with me. But Germany took in 1 million refugees from a war that America made and in which they didn't participate. Germany has confronted its history most profoundly. Little children are taught about the Holocaust in early grades, like first grade. They are asked to assume the name of a child who died in concentration camp, and to imagine packing a suitcase with what they wanted to take to concentration camp. Also, all students
taking it to school.
Yes, to bring to school the suitcase with their possessions because they have assumed the identity of a Jewish murdered child. It was an amazing experience. I'm a harbor rat. In many ways, Hamburg is a very vibrant, wicked harbor city, and I love that. So I always felt 2 things. I always felt a bit tense and a bit pleased because the city, parts of the city were so inviting, and because Germans had learned. There was still, a little, the AfD right now, the German right wing, is now got seats in the in parliament, in the Reichstag, and so it is scary. But they're putting up a fight, whereas we are not putting up a fight against that. So I like the city. I have been back now so many times because I'm constantly invited to talk about my experience. And I am greeted with so much affection and esteem in some way, but affection and I'm very touched. And I remember my Hands of War was translated and published in German. And the first reading I had in Germany when I described my mother's suicide attempt, for some reason, I burst into the most horrific, sobs. My whole body shook with sobs, and I felt embarrassed by this outburst, with snot sniveling down my face and tears, and it was very distressful. And people formed a sort of warmness around me. And one woman, and then when I regained my composure, I said, this hadn't happened to me. I've read this, in Politics and Prose and in other places where I have been invited to read from my book. And I don't understand what happened. So one woman said to me, I think it is because you're reading this in German and in the place where this story happened, and it put a different light to it. So in answer, a long answer, because it is a long answer, it is because I have finally come to accept the fact that I'm German, something that I never accepted for decades. I just evaded the question because I told I have an accent, and it's such a weird accent that nobody could really quite pin it down exactly, and depending on whether I'm tired or not or something. And so I always evaded it because I did not want to belong to a nation that had committed such vile stuff. And so when I went back, I was neither German, I wasn't American, because in America, I'm not American either, because I have an accent and I'm other. So I am a stateless person with a lot of friends and a lot of love in my life.
So we have a few more questions coming in. The next one is from Miyuki Kita. Did you have a chance to see Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer in Mississippi? What was her reaction to know you actually came to Mississippi?
No, I never did see my heroine again. And I hope she knew that I had promised her that I would go to Mississippi. And I think she believed me because I promised. And I'm one of those people who, if I make a promise, I keep it. And the odd thing was, the reason I was on the bus with Fannie Lou Hamer was because I was becoming an American citizen on the 28th of August, 1964.
64.
64. My darling is confusing me now. And I had missed all the connections back home. So the only way I could get back to DC was to ask the Mississippi bus whether I could go. And so I became a citizen in Baltimore. And the only person of color was my dear friend Laura, who had come with Danny, our son, and who had on a denim jacket with protest buttons plastered all over, and Laura. And so when the judge came in, he told us that there were 68 people becoming citizens of the most liberal and wonderful country, the freest country in the world. And he carried on like that and never once mentioned the situation of Black people who were being discriminated against and murdered, and never once talked about the fact that America only existed because it killed its native population. And that really struck me. A woman from the DAR lady with a sort of pink pillbox hat and white gloves, handed out these diplomas to say that you were a citizen with little ribbons on it. But she couldn't get herself to give it to me because I had come off the bus. I was in jeans. I had, as you remember, I had very long hair, which was unkempt. I was unwashed. And so she put her hand behind her back. And so I just bent behind her and took it and curtsied and said F you to her. And as I walked back to Laura and Danny and Laura began to sing We Shall Overcome. And there was nothing anybody could do because I was an American citizen. So.
So we have another question from Liz Gaudet. This is about immigration. What do you think the US should do about immigration? Somehow the actual people at the border get caught in the middle of policy discussions and are suffering. What can we do?
Wow, that is a hard question.
Yes.
The way I would approach it if I had the power is I would help people in their own countries to the absolute max, because people don't really want to leave their countries to come to an unknown place where they know they're most likely not welcome, where they, for the most part, don't speak the language. So I think I would start by trying to help them in their own countries, but also with all the, if I had the power, with all the power granted in me. Failing that, I would let people come to this country. The country is vast. I mean, Daniel and I have taken 4 cross-country road trips. There are areas that are completely, open spaces. So there is a lot of work that can be done. There is a lot of space to house them. I would say, let people come in. I mean, that's what I would do. I am not, I'm an immigrant. I had a lot of trouble becoming an American citizen. I had to provide so much information because I was an activist. I was also asked whether I knew any communists. Well, I did. I lived in Europe. My father was a communist until the Hitler-Stalin Pact. So, I guess I was kind of sassy when I was asked that. And I said, well, how do I know them? Are they identifiable in any way? Do they bear physical marks and stuff like that? But then I was also asked to provide proof of residence for every 6 months that I had been in the country. And that was at that point, 12 years. And I couldn't figure out, what to do. So, and I was constantly asked about SNCC, and also oddly enough by the Japan-America Society. We belong to the Japan-America Society because I loved the Japanese art. I loved the refined taste of, Japanese flower arrangements, the arrangements of food and tea ceremonies. So this was, just a beautiful, wonderful social thing. But this, for some reason, freaked them out. And so I constantly had to explain, that I went to tea ceremonies. And, I never once had that I can remember, a political discussion among my first, in fact, I think my first friend in Washington, D.C., 2 of them, one was a Black man who has become, in the meantime, America's foremost sculptor. and a Japanese woman. And so, anyway, so becoming a citizen was very difficult, but the way America now treats people wanting to become citizens is even worse. And I think the heartlessness of America vis-a-vis people who are fleeing horrible conditions, both economic as well as physical danger, is for me reason enough to let people come to this country. We can take care of them. If Germany can do it, a much smaller country, not nearly as rich, can do it, why can't we?
Thank you. There's a question for clarification. So Lisa Holm says, could you please clarify, were you speaking of the Kraft family earlier and to this day boycott
No,
Krupp?
K-R-U-P-P.
Lisa, do you want to ask anything more about that?
No, I'm all set. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. So Corey, do you want to ask your question directly?
Sure. Oops. So I wanted to ask, I mean, first of all, I want to thank you. This was wonderful today, but I wanted to ask, what would be your main message that you would want us to learn today? And do you have any recommendations of how we can put it into practice?
My recommendation is never be silent. Always speak up when you hear or see an injustice done. Don't stand by. Don't allow people to say things in your presence that directly harms someone else, or by innuendo harm somebody. I think that we are each other's sisters and brothers, and we have to behave that way. We are one human family, and we have to protect each other. And that my advice would be is never ever be silent. Don't allow somebody to use the N-word, or don't allow somebody to say something about somebody who is Chinese or Japanese or Rohingya or whatever. Speak up. As a human being, it is our duty to act like human beings and not like animals. And so this is the lesson my father taught me, is if you're silent, then you're part of the problem. If you're silent, you are just exactly like the person who is perpetrating whatever it is that is against another human being. So it is painful, it is hard, and it is especially hard for young people to do this. I know when I was very young and was confronted with things, when I confronted my boss about why Joanne had to clean bathrooms when she had already finished university and I was just starting, when she spoke English so much better than I, how come she was cleaning bathrooms and not doing what I was doing? And he looked at me as though I had fallen from Mars. You know, he just looked with such incomprehension that I couldn't make him see what I was asking. And so I quit my job. And for young people, it is harder, but I have so much faith in young people because we have seen them come out. We have seen them come out against guns, for trying to save climate, to save the climate. We have seen them come out for Black Lives Matter and other injustices. So my faith is in young people. but it is hard because it is hard when you are young to stand up against unmitigated ugliness. When the adults you see, the adults in power behave like crazed, I don't know what, when you see the Republicans not see the humanity of other people, it is infuriating. So young people are doing it. We have been to so many demonstrations after Parkland, after Sandy Hook, after other places. And it is young people who are out. It is young people who are taking up the mantle of the young people of the 60s who went to Mississippi, who were the civil rights movement. And it is Reagan who dismantled everything with the Supreme Court, with Republican help. It is something, it is vote. The minute you are 18, vote. Sam turned 18 just a few days before the last election, and he had his heart set on Bernie for president. But he wasn't an idiot. He's a smart young man, and he voted for Biden. And this is what we have to do. We can't always say, oh, if he or she isn't going to be my candidate, I'm not going to vote. You have to vote. Voting is the most important thing to beat these people who are trying to take away all rights from certain groups of people, to give it to a small certain group of other people. Speak up, stand up, and fight, but always non-violently. Never use violence, never use a gun, never use your fists. Don't use hideous language. Do it with respect and tolerance, always.
We're getting some comments as well. Professor Simone Alter-Muri writes, thank you for who you are and what you're handing down to the next generation. I am in awe. And Phyllis Lerner says, I am also in the DC area and I invite the Springfield family to come here, speak up, demonstrate, get internships, work, and be active on behalf of our society. So yeah, let's talk some more, Phyllis. But we do have another question from Eileen, who is my friend and neighbor. And she says, do you know Bob Zellner through SNCC? He's the father of a friend of mine.
Yes. Yes.
Eileen, do you want to say anything more?
That's so wonderful.
Because of my and Daniel's life. I mean, this is not something that I have done on my own. This has been done with my beloved Daniel. And I also want to say about Daniel, when we met, I had never, ever told anybody that I was a Holocaust survivor. It was just, I never wanted to be looked at or thought of as, oh, that poor little victim. I did not want to be everybody's victim. I don't want to be a victimizer, but I didn't want to be a victim. Daniel and I met, and there was something in the air, don't know what it was, but we met. We have been together since the day we met, and we talked. The first night we talked, we also made love. And it wasn't very long before I told Daniel my story. And he was the very, very first person I've ever told my story to. And Daniel held me up to when I thought I couldn't take something anymore. He was the person with so much strength that his strength invaded me completely. So I became strong. I'm an opinionated woman. I'm a strong woman, but the way I see it, I owe a lot of that to Daniel. Being on my side without criticism, he has seen me through all my demons, all my joys, and all my happinesses. And so that when I went to Mississippi, he didn't want me to go because it was dangerous. And our friends in the movement said, you can't go, you are small, you are vulnerable, you're by yourself. Daniel's thing was I'd break both my legs if I thought I could stop her. But he was supportive. And he understood why it was important for me to do this. I became a fighter because of what I went through. I became a fighter on behalf of every person who has been murdered or who has been in a genocide. And it's not just Jews. We are doing this all over the world. My biggest sadness is we have learned nothing. We have seen the worst that humanity can do to others, and we learned absolutely nothing. We are doing it everywhere in the world. We are doing it in Myanmar. We are doing it in China. We are doing it in America. We are doing it everywhere. And we are murdering. We are murdering children. We are a country where we have more guns than we have human beings. We seem to be operating on hate rather than love and tolerance. And this is something that has been bugging me all of my life, is why can't we just let go? Wouldn't it be so much easier not to hate? To me, it would seem so much easier, because I would assume that it takes a lot of energy to hate. You hurt yourself as much, if not more, by hating than the object of your hate. And so I don't know.
Marianne, just sorry to interrupt. So we are gonna need to end soon. There is another event at 6 actually on the N-word that folks here are probably
Oh, wow, yes.
be joining. But we do have time for, one more question, if anyone wants to throw a question into the chat. But we do have some more comments for you that I'd like to read to you. One from Kathy Post. Thank you so much. What an amazing life you've had, and that you continue to live as a model for equity and justice. And then Calvin Hill, Dr. Calvin Hill, thank you. Thank you for your story, your courage, and for reminding us that silence is not an option. And then Judith Ginsburg writes, thank you so much for imparting your experience and wisdom. You are such an amazing inspiration and model, and I am honored to be in your virtual presence.
Wow.
And Peter Helling says, thanks from Hamburg. Love you, Peter. So if Marianne wants to, we can kind of linger here if people want to chat. We'll kind of formally end the event.
I have one little story that I'll impart, and this goes to injustice or hate. And that is many, many years ago, when our son was still a toddler, a good friend of mine, who was the first Black anchorman for ABC, Max Robinson. And I were talking one day about all kinds of things. As you remember, our talks were always, politics and all kinds of things. And I had said something about Germans because I had still really not recovered altogether about how I felt about them. And so I said something that was probably very, hostile. And Max looked at me and said, "Oh, Marianne, I am so upset because I thought you were the most tolerant, least bigoted person I have ever met in my entire life." And this took my breath away. And I thought about it, and then I thought about our son, and I thought, I can't teach my son this negative feeling I have. I have to come to terms with that. And I thought about it, and then I thought, yes, Germans my age have no part in what happened, none whatsoever. They're guiltless. The only thing, and I say this to Germans, ask the older people in your life what they did or didn't do. And so I said to myself that Max is right. I need to revisit and re-examine myself vis-a-vis my feelings toward Germans. And so I called Max and I apologized and said, I am really sorry that I've disappointed you, but I'm very happy that you told me this because it is very important that you did, because I have taken it to heart. So that, it's people speaking out. Max spoke out and said to me what disturbed him. And and it changed me. It made me so aware of how easy it is to fall into some, I hate, I don't like, it is stop yourself from falling into that. And Max is the one who pricked this and made me, I hope, a better person.
Max's brother is the one who organized
Yes. And Max's brother is the one who organized the action against the South African government. So life is interesting and life is amazing. And if you let it, life can also be full of love.
And a constant model of that, for sure. Ashanta put a comment in there. Ashanta, do you want to just speak it aloud? You wrote, it wasn't about canceling anyone.
Oh, it was just about, when someone is in the process of learning based on their experience, and being able to talk to someone about that and not have it be a public shaming or being about, not being friends with that person or not talking to them anymore, but, sharing, how something made you feel, and allowing that to be what it is.
Yes, do it. Tell somebody if you perceive them not to understand what you are about and what you feel and what your feeling is in what is happening now. And for you, this must be just sheer hell. I can only imagine the hell. But talk to that person. Talk to people like that, because not everyone will reject something that you can tell them about your situation, about yourself. Approach them and say, look, this is what I am. I'm a woman of color. This is what happens in my life that doesn't happen in your life. Explain yourself, explain your feelings. And I think that probably not all the time, but I think you will reach some people. But also you have to speak up. Don't take it in and make it something that is hurtful to you. You speak up too. Because I think that you have a lot to teach people who are not like you and who don't have your experiences. So I think that go ahead. And you look strong. I hope you are. And but you will only become stronger. And I wish you luck. And I'm on your side.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everything.
But thank you.
Well, Ashanta speaks up. She's a friend of mine and she always speaks up. Maybe this is a good place to stop. Phyllis says, thank you for your voice, actions, writing, and love, creating a legacy of resilience. Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much, Marianne. I can't thank you enough.
But I thank you. I thank everybody. I think this has been wonderful. It's also, sometimes revisiting certain things create some kind of mental and even physical tension because you relive something that you think, I often think, oh, I've put all of that behind me. But I realize since the 2016 election, I haven't put anything behind me because just this one thing has made it all come back and in force.
Wow.
I can't thank you enough. And I have to agree with you. I mean, unfortunately, I recently read The Summer of 1927 by Bill Bryson, which has really nothing to do with the Holocaust, or very little. He does speak about anti-Semitism for small portions of the book. But what I realize is exactly what you said. Here it is almost 100 years later, and I don't think we've made any progress.
No.
Very upsetting.
Yes, and we now have the horrible weapons to go along with these
right,
heads.
yeah.
So it is like we are sort of lost, as you know, on this darkling plane. I just would like to reach out and take everybody's hand and confront these forces and say, stop it. And I just, I also just wonder, what are these people teaching their children?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you take little children, they don't hate other little children because of the way they look or where they come from. They may be angry at a child because they don't play ball the way you want them to, or because of some other kind of totally other. So it has to be taught. So who is teaching it? The teachers in school, the parents, the grandparents. You have to maybe you have to separate children of racists from the racists and put them in some place where there's love. I mean, it's a silly idea, but it's just something, because we cannot perpetuate this, because these people take guns. During one of the days after the election, we were confronted by a guy who had his hand in his pocket, and I was terrified that he was going to shoot.
Mm.
Fortunately, the Secret Service police, who got to know us and know that, they knew who we were and what we were doing, had sort of ambled up next to us because they too had observed this guy. But I was so terrified, and I thought, am I really doing the right thing, demonstrating when these people, not only are hateful, but they probably also have guns. And so,
One said he was a fascist.
yeah. Oh, and then there was one demonstration that was had nothing to do with. I think it was another anti some kind of demonstration, and we were walking by, and this young man. Oh, we had a sign that said "Fight Fascism," resist Trumpism. And this youngish man in a suit, very well put together, approached me and said, "Do you know what fascism is?" And I said, "Unfortunately, I do." And he said, "I'm a fascist." And I'm kind of stunned. And before I could say anything, he said, "I think we should follow Germany's example and put people in gas chambers." It was horrifying. It was absolutely horrifying. School groups would come during the school holidays with kids wearing the hate hats. And I would try to talk to them and explain to them, do you know what your hat says and what it supports? And so the teachers would come up and you bitch, leave the kids alone, that kind of thing. And so, being called communists and lover and, all the names you could think of that people hurl at you because they lack the intelligence to have a conversation about the issues that separate. I tried to talk to these people. They can't. They talk hateful things against people, and it's all hate and violence. And I keep trying, and I will do so until my last breath. I will not give up. I will not give in, and I will not give up. And follow John Lewis's thing: make good trouble all the time.
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
And let's learn, let's look at our past and learn.
Well,
Thank you.
Inviting me.
Definitely an
Thank you.
inspiration to us all.
yeah. Yes. Thank
That,
you. Thank
that
you.
makes me blush because
Mm.
I'm just an 85-year-old woman who is trying to do the best I can, against a sea of trouble. So I'll keep on fighting.
You also show that fighting injustice can make you very healthy and young because you're full of energy and full of
Or crazy.
no. No, not at all.
Yes, it is. I think it's when you know that you belong to the right side of history, along with other people on the right side of history. It is a good feeling, because you're not expending energy on anything but tolerance and love. This is what you're trying to do. So it is completely separated from hate. It is completely separated from things that are ugly. I see you, Peter, and I love you. I love you. I love you. Peter is my wonderful, darling Hamburg friend, and he makes my life and Daniel's life so much better for knowing him.
Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure and an honor to be with you tonight. Thank you.
And I know it's bloody late.
No, not at all.
So you are a darling, and I see your picture. I have to, every day, millions of times, every time I walk from one room to the other. I love you, I love you, I love you.
I love you
Daryl loves you too.
Thank
So
you.
this is the question of my feeling about Germany. Divided. I have many friends whom I love, and Peter is on the top of that pyramid. But there are many people, many people. There's Steph and Ulrike and too many to name. And they are also the future. They are the ones to make sure that Germany will never regress to where they were. They will go forward and they will go fight. And this is what we have to do here, because America is in danger of really bad things. And America is also really never truly and heartfelt, with heartfelt honesty, confronted how they wound up owning America. They killed people to own America. They continue to kill people to maintain their possession of America, and have not confronted what they have done to the native population, to the Black population, to the Chinese who built the railroads, women. It's just, the list is so endless. Whereas Germany has done so. It has looked at itself and said what we did was horrible, and we will learn from that. And we need to learn.
Agreed.
So,
Well,
Thank you.
yeah, so I'm gonna have to go because
okay.
but I don't know if other folks who want to hang with you. I don't know, David, do we have to give up the Zoom link or anything, or if people want to chat, or?
If people want to continue in chat, that's fine. If not, we'll just close it out.
Okay, I'll leave it on your end.
So I have to leave too, but thank you very, very much. Really.
But thank you. It was. I'm glad to know that at your university this story exists. That the Holocaust is something that is being talked about, because it needs to be a teaching tool. It needs to, we need to keep remembering that, so we, and try to teach it. So hopefully we eventually will learn to do better. And
Well, I don't know the whole history, but I think Corey has had a big hand in this committee existing and sustaining itself. And so I think that's really important for the rest of us.
right, yeah, it's a battle.
This constant, so I'll be retiring at the end of August, so somebody's got to pick up the torch.
And hopefully you'll be able to travel to all of the places you want to go to, Israel and Los Angeles, and it's been hard. It's been a hard year. We haven't I think we've been with our son and daughter-in-law and grandsons twice for an outdoor picnic, once for our 61st wedding anniversary, and once for my husband's 90th birthday. And coming by and talking with masks on while they sit in the car and we stand outside. That's not a way to love. But the last time, the first time we were together, I hugged Noah, my younger grandson, and I knew the minute I did it that I shouldn't have, but it felt so good. It felt so delicious that we continued to hug. you know, and I said, oh, what the hell, I've hugged once, I might as well do it twice more. But what else? So this is to be with people again, to touch them, to hug them, and not that. I think that one of the things that this pandemic has done is I was in danger of becoming a misogynist whenever I saw people without masks. I could feel something welling up in me that I didn't like at all because I was so angry at people who are not wearing a mask. And we live in this so-called sophisticated city. You know, you'd think that people are aware. We live on the grounds of George Washington University, and here people going around without masks and, you know, grouped together. So it's crazy.
Yeah.
And so I have to work on not becoming a misogynist toward unmasked people.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
Yes,
Yes,
thank you.
it's a
Thank
pleasure
you.
meeting you.
Appreciate it.
I
And
did too. I know you're back there.
I hope I didn't disgrace myself in your
Not
eyes.
at all.
Oh, no, not at all.
Not at all, yes. And now we have this recording and it's shareable too.
Yep.
Use
So
it
thank you.
And thank you. Thank you.
Good night.
there.
Good night.
Ciao, Bella.
Ciao, ciao.
Good night.